Chapter 58, The New York Times, page 1. Surprise GOP nominee emerges from chaos by Adam Nagorny, St. Petersburg, Florida. In one of the strangest developments in the annals of American politics, the Republican Party early Thursday morning chose as its presidential nominee the international activist Philip Horkman, who faces federal charges of terrorism and ship hijacking, and who told the GOP convention delegates in his brief acceptance speech that he is a registered Democrat. The nomination culminated a strange and chaotic night that began with the convention deadlocked over the nominee with no apparent breakthrough in sight. At about 9:20 p.m., as the delegates were preparing for yet another ballot, the convention hall was electrified by the appearance in Donald Trump's private box of Mr. Horkman and his colleague Jeffrey Peckerman, who, with Mr. Horkman, has engaged in a series of daring international exploits, boldly spearheading pro-democracy movements in Cuba, Somalia, the Middle East, and China. The two men, both clad in the Air China blankets that have become an international symbol of their efforts, were called to the stage, where they received a rapturous ovation lasting more than 45 minutes. It was then that the night took an even stranger turn, as Mr. Peckerman delivered a bizarre, profanity-laden speech, much of which seemed to involve toilets. In parentheses, Mr. Peckerman is a forensic plumber, close parentheses. The purpose of the speech, to the extent that it seemed to have one, apparently was to place Mr. Trump's name in nomination, although Mr. Trump later denied having any knowledge of such an effort. The speech was poorly received, both by Mr. Horkman, who stood nearby shaking his head throughout, and by the delegates, many of whom appeared shocked by Mr. Peckerman's coarse language. The mood on the convention floor turned openly hostile following the speech. As Republican dignitaries filled the stage, Mr. Peckerman went to the front of the lectern and urinated on Sarah Palin, former Alaska governor and GOP vice presidential candidate, who was waving to the crowd. Mr. Peckerman was rushed from the stage by security officers, but not before he also urinated on a large segment of the Florida delegation. At that point, with the convention on the verge of anarchy, Mr. Horkman stepped to the lectern, quieted the crowd, and offered an emotional apology for the behavior of Mr. Peckerman, whom Mr. Horkman described as, quote, an idiot, although to be honest, that is insulting to idiots, end quote. Mr. Horkman then delivered an impromptu speech touching on the need for civility in political discourse, the value of bipartisanship, and the paramount importance of spaying and neutering household pets. His remarks appeared to have a powerful calming effect on the delegates, who responded with enthusiastic applause and then a sustained chant of "We want Horkman." As the chant echoed through the hall, growing in intensity with each passing minute, party leaders hastily met with members of the Rules Committee. Then, in a development that stunned political observers, Mr. Horkman's name was placed in nomination. The nomination was quickly seconded, and in what was surely one of the quickest and loudest roll call votes ever taken in a national political convention, unanimously approved by the wildly cheering delegates officially at 3:23 a.m. The rapid sequence of events appeared to stun Mr. Horkman, who appeared bewildered as he was led to the lectern to deliver a brief acceptance speech, which began with the statement, "I think there's been a mistake." However, this produced only louder cheers as the delegates continued to express their, in italics it says continued on page A14. Chapter 59. The NBC Nightly News. Brian Williams. The strangest election season in the nation's history got even stranger tonight. As Democrats gather in Charlotte, North Carolina for their national convention, it has become virtually certain that, thanks to an overwhelming and unprecedented last-minute shift in delegate loyalties, the Democrats will nominate as their presidential candidate none other than Jeffrey Peckerman. This comes at a time when the political world is still reeling from last week's Republican convention, where the delegates chose as their standard bearer the other member of the Fantasmas de la Noche, Philip Horkman, apparently without realizing that he is a registered Democrat. On that night, Republican delegates were responding to Horkman's criticism of Peckerman, who delivered a profanity-filled speech before relieving himself on the convention stage on former Alaska Governor Sarah Palin. But it is those same controversial actions by Peckerman that have made him a hero to some Democrats, who feel it's time their party was led by a fighter who would stand up to the Republicans. For more on this, we turn to NBC News political correspondent Robert Stavis. Robert? Stavis. Brian, that's exactly right. While most Democrats agree that the Palin incident was over the top, they feel that Peckerman was making an important symbolic point, which is that for too long their party has allowed itself to be urinated on, metaphorically speaking, by the Republicans, without having the will, as a party, to urinate back. They're mad as hell, Brian, and they're thrilled to find somebody who seems to be as mad as they are. Williams. But what about Peckerman's speech, the language he used, and all those references to the toilets? Stavis. It was crude, Brian, no doubt about it, but many Democrats feel Peckerman was deliberately using shocking language to draw attention to valid issues. For example, when he asks whether Americans would rather have, and this is a direct quote, Iraq or strong toilets, he was graphically yet eloquently illustrating the fact that our involvement in foreign wars has weakened our ability to maintain our crumbling infrastructure. Williams. What about Peckerman's party affiliation? Stavis. As far as we've been able to determine, Brian, he has never registered to vote or engaged in any political activity whatsoever, although he was once charged with assault for allegedly punching a 67-year-old woman who was running for the school board and tried to put a campaign sign on his swale. Those charges were dropped when the woman refused to testify, some say because of BB gun injuries to her dog. Williams. Fascinating. Speaking of charges being dropped, in light of their humanitarian work in Cuba, Somalia, the Middle East, and China, both Peckerman and Horkman have received full presidential pardons for any crimes involved in the acts of terrorism and hijacking that they allegedly committed. Peckerman also will not face any charges in connection with the incident involving Governor Palin, who has said she does not want to prolong the matter any further, although she has reportedly told friends in private that if she ever gets Peckerman alone, she will castrate him with a hockey stick. And so, with the legal obstacles out of the way, and the Democratic nomination all but locked up, it appears that the American voters will face one of the most unusual choices in the nation's history: Philip Horkman or Jeffrey Peckerman. In 3 months, one of these men will be elected to the most powerful position on the planet. The question now is, which one will the voters choose? And on the next page it says, 3 months later. And the next page begins chapter 60. The New York Times, page 1. Begley Jr., Penn win White House in historic upset by Adam Nagorny. In a stunning rebuke to the two major political parties, on Tuesday, long-shot outsiders Ed Begley Jr. and Sean Penn were elected President and Vice President of the United States, the first third-party candidates ever to win these offices. Only weeks ago, Begley Jr. and Penn, representing the persons of race, ethnicity, and gender party, were considered extreme long shots, but they managed to eke out a majority of the electoral vote, thanks largely to a historically low voter turnout, resulting from what can only be described as disastrous campaigns run by both the Republican and Democratic parties, both of which had nominated men who were popular celebrities, but also untested political neophytes. The Republican candidate, Philip Horkman, is a registered Democrat who refused to campaign at all, stating that he was, quote, very uncomfortable, end quote, with much of the GOP platform. He also stated repeatedly that he did not intend to vote for himself. The Democratic candidate, Jeffrey Peckerman, did campaign enthusiastically in the early days after the convention, but his erratic behavior and profane oratory, repeatedly using terms such as commies and fags, often in reference to people sharing the platform with him, quickly disillusioned the Democratic base. Party leaders tried to muzzle Mr. Peckerman by denying him staff and travel expenses, but he continued to make public appearances, often with the help of non-political sponsors, including Hooters and the video production company Girls Gone Wild. Movements arose in both the Republican and Democratic parties to replace Horkman and Peckerman, but these efforts were hindered by legal technicalities as well as the feeling on each side that no matter how bad its candidate was, the other side's candidate was worse. In the end, an unprecedented number of voters decided to simply stay home on Election Day, resulting in a nationwide turnout of 9% of the electorate, the lowest ever recorded in any Western democracy, and a narrow victory for Mr. Begley and Mr. Penn. In declaring victory, Mr. Begley Jr. called for Americans to join him in, quote, taking America in a new direction with smaller cars and a lot less dietary gluten, close parentheses. He also announced that he would appoint Barbara Streisand too, and continued on page 812. Chapter 61, Philip. I had read somewhere that many of NASA's astronauts had trouble readjusting to life on Earth after they returned from the moon. That being in outer space, where they looked back and saw our planet as a small speck in a very populated galaxy, changed their perspective on life so dramatically that they had difficulty reconnecting with loved ones who couldn't possibly feel the way they now did. Would the same thing happen to me, I wondered. As I sat in that private jet for the last time, now as a defeated presidential candidate, the romantic in me was hoping for a happy ending, hoping that Daisy and the kids would be at the door when I got to the house and we'd go forward from where we'd left off. Was it possible? I had called Daisy right after my concession speech. I had told her that I understood why she wasn't there, the way wives of the losers are traditionally at their husbands' sides, as a display of family support and unity. I told her that I understood that Heidi and Trace had school the next day, that I was looking forward to seeing her, and pretended to understand when she couldn't say the same thing to me. This probably shouldn't have surprised me, as things between us had deteriorated during the campaign. At first, she did make an effort to be a candidate's wife by allowing herself to be profiled on an MSNBC special about the potential first ladies, and even though she too is a registered Democrat, drove around with the Republican Party slogan, parentheses and quotes, "the other guy is worse," on the bumper of our SUV. She had even joined me at a few stops along the trail, had her parents come over to stay with the kids while she flew to places like Buffalo and Kansas City. I could see she was trying her best, despite the fact that she was totally out of her element, and I did my best to show my appreciation. But eventually the tumult of crowds and the intrusion of the media into what should have been our private lives made her more and more uncomfortable, and she eventually retreated into a protective mode when Peckerman pulled that stunt during our third televised debate. You remember. After I'd answered Katie Couric's question about the national deficit by saying, "No matter what your political affiliations are, I think it's fair to say that any system which allows Warren Buffett to pay fewer taxes than his secretary needs to be re-examined." Peckerman, as soon as the audience's applause in that auditorium died down, responded by holding up a picture of our son, Trace, doing a grand plie during a performance of Swan Lake, and said, "Take a gander at this homo." Had I changed? Well, how could I not? Since the preceding spring, after that fateful soccer game when I called Peckerman's daughter offside, parentheses, and she was offside, by the way, close parentheses, I had been a fugitive, had fallen so deeply in love with another woman that I jumped off an ocean liner to save her from drowning, helped liberate literally millions of oppressed people, and was a candidate for the presidency of the United States. No one could possibly experience all that and not be affected. Were Daisy and I different people? Was the more relevant question. And had we grown so far apart that our marriage wouldn't be able to withstand the change in our definitions? Before this entire episode, I was more than content to be a husband, father, and pet store owner. And she was happy being the wife of that guy. But now? That was the question that hounded me during that flight, the ride home from the airport, and the walk to the front door of what I was hoping could still be my happy home. And it was answered after I let myself in and walked through the darkened house and into the master bedroom, where I found a note on my pillow that said, "Let's take things slowly, okay?" Next to my sleeping wife, to whom I leaned over and whispered, "Okay." So that's what we've been doing. At home, I've been slowly slipping back into the rhythms of my family's life. And at work, I'm not only pleased to be back selling pets at the wine shop, possibly due to my national profile. Business is not only booming, but our plans for expansion will soon be a reality. And to complete the picture, I've gone back to refereeing the local soccer games. In fact, this very afternoon, you'll be able to find me running up and down the field with the whistle in my mouth in the AYSO Girls Under 11 Championship game. And the best part? That Peckerman's daughter is 12 years old, so there's no chance that I'll be seeing that moron ever again. Yes, life is good. Chapter 62, Jeffrey. You want to know what I learned from all this? I learned an important lesson about life, which I will never forget, namely, if Donald Trump tells you he's going to give you $1 million, don't believe him because he's a fucking liar. That's right. He never paid me a nickel, asshole. All the Republicans are assholes. And by the way, I'm not saying that the Democrats aren't assholes. Oh, sure, they nominated me for president. Big whoop. After that, they totally screwed me over. Let me ask you this. If you're the candidate for president, shouldn't you get to pick where you campaign? Shouldn't you get to decide where the motorcade goes? That's what I thought, but that's not the way it worked. I had all these dipshit little suit-wearing handlers handling me, and every day they give me a schedule that would say something like 7 a.m., shake hands with workers outside a factory in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and stress the 4-point plan to bring economic blah, blah, blah. So I'd inform the handlers that I, as the candidate, had some problems with the schedule, such as 1, 7 a.m., 2, outside a factory, 3, in Fort fucking Wayne, 4, Indiana. I'd say, how about instead I go shake hands with some workers in Vegas? And they'd say, you already did Vegas 3 times. You can't keep going to Vegas. So I'd say, okay, what about the Bahamas? And they'd say the Bahamas weren't part of the United States. I checked that on Wikipedia, and it turns out they were right, but it gives you an idea of what kind of nitpicky dipshits they were. And then there were the speeches. They'd write these long, bore-ass speeches for me to give, and if I didn't read every word exactly the way it was written on the paper, the handlers would have a hissy fit. Like, one time I was giving a speech in Detroit, talking about how concerned I was about all the economic blah, blah, blah of Detroit, and to emphasize the point, I kind of gestured around at Detroit and said, I mean, look at this shithole. Right away, I could see all my handlers making no gestures with their hands. So I pointed at the audience and said, these people live here. You think they don't know it's a shithole? And then the sound system went dead, which happened more and more often before they totally stopped scheduling speeches for me. My point is, the Democrats are just as big assholes as the Republicans are. As you go through life, pretty much everybody you meet turns out to be an asshole. That was the other lesson I learned from all this. I'll be honest, the only reason I even ran for president was I was afraid to go home. I think I mentioned this, but Donna, my wife, is Italian. She has a temper, and she knows, parentheses, don't ask me how I know this, close parentheses, at least 3 ways to kill a person using only oregano. After the Republican convention, I tried to call her a couple times, but I could tell she wasn't ready to get back together because of the tone she had in her voice when she told me I should fuck myself with a trombone. So I stayed away and ran for president. I think I would have won except for the handler dipshits. Get this. On election night, they wanted me to go on television and concede because of the Electoral College. I said, I'm not conceding anything because A, I never heard of any Electoral College, and B, Ed Begley Jr. and Sean Penn are a pair of, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, just a factual observation, faggots. So I never did concede. But after the election, the Democrats stopped paying my expenses and I couldn't go home, so I moved into the guest house of the second largest Hooters franchise owner in northern New Jersey. And although he and his girlfriend Tracy are both lovely and generous people, after a couple of months I got the feeling that maybe they wanted me to move on because of some remarks they made, and also they cut off my electricity. Plus I miss Donna and I really miss Taylor. So finally I had this idea, which seemed a little crazy, but I was desperate. I remembered that back when I first started dating Donna, I bought her this Hello Kitty stuffed doll, which was stupid, but she loved it, or at least she acted like she loved it, by which I mean only minutes later I reached third base. So here's what I did. I went on eBay and got the exact same Hello Kitty stuffed doll, used. Then I waited for Valentine's Day, and at supper time I went to the front door of my house and rang the doorbell. I admit I was nervous as shit standing there holding the Hello Kitty. It was raining, and I felt like a guy in a movie waiting to see if his wife is going to take him back. From inside the house, I heard footsteps coming to the door. I almost ran away, but I didn't. Then the door opened, and there she was, looking exactly the way I remembered her. The cleaning lady. I forget her name, something like Slubka. She's Russian or Polish or something, and she has a mustache, and we don't get along because of an issue she and I got into once involving something she claimed she found in a pair of my underwear that I'm not going to discuss here, except to say she's a fucking liar. Slubka told me that Donna and Taylor were at the mall, so I gave her the Hello Kitty to give to Donna. She took it by one corner like I was handing her a bag of raccoon puss. I wasn't sure she would even give it to Donna, but she did, because I called the next day, and Donna answered and told me if I ever gave her a used gift again, with stains on it from God knows where, she would shove it up my ass, which was her way of saying I could come home. So now things are pretty good. I'm not saying great. I still sleep on a cot in the garage, but at least I'm home, and my life is settling down. The TV and newspaper assholes have pretty much stopped coming around and doing stories about whatever happened to me. I got kicked out of the National Association of Forensic Plumbers National Association because they're a bunch of assholes, but the joke is on them because my show Forensic Plumbing got picked up by a major cable channel, Comedy Central, which is paying me good money to make more episodes. At first I thought since they're called Comedy Central that they wanted me to make the shows humorous. But they said no. They want me to do exactly what I've been doing. So, like I said, things are pretty good. The best thing is being able to spend time with Taylor, who's a great kid. And by the way, not to brag, she's also a really good soccer player. She's a forward, and I'm pretty excited because today she's playing in the AYSO League Under 11 Girls Division Championship. Taylor's actually 12, but the Under 11 team had some injuries and needed a last-minute replacement player, so I told them Taylor was 11 and gave them a doctor birth certificate. So this afternoon she'll be out there and I'll be on the sideline rooting hard for her and making sure her team doesn't get screwed over. Because if there's one lesson I have learned in life, it's that nothing is more important than your kid.